All right, you lovely lot. Emily Bennett here, and today we're diving into something you might not expect: how lessons from British rule over India can actually apply to a modern office environment. Now, stick with me, because I know it sounds a bit out there, but there are some real strategic principles from that historical period, both good and bad, that can actually be used to create a more productive, respectful, and sustainable office culture. Now, this all came up during a catch-up with my good friend Jules, who's running her own media company. She was dealing with a bit of a leadership challenge and was asking for some advice on how to manage things. And as we talked, it got me thinking about how lessons from British colonial rule, centralized leadership, delegation, flexibility, can all be adapted to modern business. Crazy, right? But let's get into it, because the twists and turns of that time hold some bold truths that can help us lead smarter today. Grab yourself a cuppa, and let's dive in. 1. Centralized leadership with delegation. Strong leadership, empowered teams. Let's start with one of the major principles of British rule: centralized leadership with local delegation. The British had a strong central command, but relied on local rulers and intermediaries to maintain control across vast regions. Now, in an office, this translates to having a clear leadership structure, but making sure your team leaders are empowered to handle the day-to-day operations. It's not about micromanaging, it's about trusting your team to know their areas better than you do. I gave Jules this exact advice for her media company. You've got to set the vision, love, but let your managers take the reins on how it's implemented. And sure enough, as soon as she started delegating more, the team's performance went up. Trust goes a long way. Actionable. Tip: set big picture goals and let your managers handle the details. Delegation isn't weakness, it's smart leadership. 2. Flexibility and adaptability. Adjust to the situation. One thing the British were experts at during their rule in India was adaptability. They changed their tactics depending on the situation, sometimes using treaties, other times force, and occasionally a bit of diplomacy. Not always the nicest way, but it was effective for them at the time. In the office, this translates into knowing when to adjust your management style. Some employees need more structure. Others thrive on independence. When Jules was having trouble managing different teams with a one-size-fits-all approach, I told her, "You've got to be a bit more fluid. Some teams will need more freedom. Others will need you to be hands-on." By tailoring her leadership to different teams, Jules saw a big improvement in engagement and productivity. Actionable tip: adapt your leadership style depending on the team. Flexibility is key in navigating a dynamic work environment. 3. Focus on long-term strategy. Think beyond today. Now, if there's one thing the British were great at, it was playing the long game. They didn't conquer India overnight. It was centuries of slow, strategic expansion, building infrastructure, trade, and influence. They thought decades ahead. In the office, this is all about having a long-term strategy. It's easy to get caught up in the day-to-day grind, but as a leader, you need to be thinking years ahead, aligning your short-term actions with a big picture vision. I asked Jules, "What's your long-term vision for the company? Are your daily decisions feeding into that?" Once she started thinking long-term, she found it much easier to make decisions that felt aligned and sustainable. Actionable tip: create a long-term business plan and communicate it to the team. Ensure daily tasks feed into a bigger, strategic vision. 4. Empower local experts. Trust your team's knowledge. The British often relied on local knowledge to maintain control. Whether through local rulers or intermediaries, they knew they couldn't manage everything themselves. And that's a lesson in humility for any modern office. Trust the people who are closest to the problems to solve them. Jules was struggling with feeling like she had to make every decision herself. But once she started leaning on her team's expertise, things started flowing. Her marketing lead knows way more about social media trends than she does. So why not let them run with it? Actionable tip. Give your team ownership of their areas. They're the experts. Let them lead the way. 5. Clear communication and policies. No room for confusion. The British introduced Western laws and standardized systems in India, which helped maintain order, sometimes too rigidly, but it did create consistency. In a modern office, it's all about having clear policies and expectations. When rules are well defined, there's less room for confusion, and everyone knows where they stand. I told Jules, "You've got to be clear with your team. Lay down the ground rules and make sure everyone knows their role. It doesn't have to be draconian, just make sure there's clarity. Confusion leads to chaos, and chaos isn't good for business." Actionable. Tip. Develop a clear employee handbook and communicate policies regularly. Clarity creates cohesion. 6. Learning from mistakes. Adapt and innovate. Here's where the British tripped up a bit. They were slow to adapt sometimes, like when the Indian Rebellion of 1857 happened because of their rigid policies. But they did learn, introducing railways, telegraphs, and modern education systems. In a modern office, it's all about knowing when to learn from mistakes and innovate. Jules had a project flop recently, and instead of seeing it as a failure, we looked at it as an opportunity to innovate. What can you do differently next time, I asked? Yeah, it turns out that failure opened up new ideas and better systems. Actionable tip. Treat failures as opportunities to adapt and innovate. Regularly evaluate whether your policies and practices are still relevant. 7. Balancing power with fairness. Avoid exploitation. Now, let's not gloss over the darker side of British rule. There was a lot of exploitation, high taxes, and inequality. It's a good reminder for us in the workplace. Just because you have power doesn't mean you should abuse it. In the office, it's about fairness and transparency. Micromanagement, favoritism, or overburdening your team can create a toxic environment. Jules realized she was expecting too much from her team, and once she backed off and created a more balanced workload, morale improved massively. Actionable tip. Keep things fair and transparent. Don't overburden employees and make sure everyone has the same opportunities. 8. Embrace cultural diversity. Strength in differences. One of the British Empire's biggest mistakes was ignoring India's rich cultural diversity, which led to resentment. Today, we know better. Diversity is a strength. In your office, embrace the different cultures, experiences, and perspectives of your team. It leads to better ideas, creativity, and problem-solving. I suggested to Jules to introduce cultural celebrations in the office, and the team absolutely loved it. It's all about creating an inclusive culture. Actionable tip. Foster an inclusive workplace. Celebrate diversity and make sure your policies reflect that. Outro. So there you have it. A few bold and surprising lessons from British rule over India that you can actually apply to a modern office. From delegating responsibility to learning from your mistakes, empowering your team to embracing diversity. There's a lot we can learn from history, both good and bad. Let me know in the comments, what's one lesson you're taking away from this? And don't forget to subscribe for more cheeky insights into leadership, business, and everything in between. Cheers for watching, and remember, lead with strategy, not control, and your office will thrive.